Hello everyone and welcome back into another edition here of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Happy Friday to you all. This will be the last show of the week. I am as always your host, Christopher Shepard, and we should have a great show ahead to conclude the week. It's Stardom, Sit-'em Day. The last minute decisions you might want to make in your fantasy roster will be determined in my first couple of segments, whether or not you were willing to start a certain player or might want to avoid them this week. Then we get into big fantasy stakes in the best NFL games of the weekend, potentially. Gonna be going over a very specific conference championship matchup in the world of college football this weekend that could have several different implications for the outcome of the final CFP rankings. And then last but not least, we're doing some Stardom Sit-'em yet again, but for Sunday Night Football in terms of that big matchup in the AFC West. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you, yet again, as always, if you want more content such as this, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show in the network. Great way to get involved with the channel, to promote. Everything's going very well here with a lot of different people doing great things with great shows as well in every single sport imaginable. So it's greatly appreciated should you choose to do that. But if you want to interact with our shows a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can also do it on our website, gsmcpodcast.net. Leave a tip, a donation, or comment there, or just do it through YouTube as well. Either way works wonders for this show. It just makes it that much better, that much more interactive, gets you guys out there in terms of your opinions and thoughts on the show as well. But without further ado, let us jump into our first segment of the day here in the show, talking about my favorite starts of Week 14. As always, I compile rankings throughout the week at each position, letting you know which players I believe are viable assets or potential starts for you. And these players on today's list are the final compilation of all these positions, my top players for each of them. So without further ado, let us jump right into them. Starting off with the QB position, this guy is a little bit of an unfortunate player right now in terms of real life because he's putting up historic stats, but his team is not winning football games with them. And so, even though from a real-life standpoint, you have to feel sorry for him in terms of fantasy, he's still the premier guy probably right now in terms of a quarterbacking standpoint. So, it is Joe Burrow who gets the start. I'm going to have to check again. Sorry that I do not remember who they are going to be playing this specific weekend. But, as always, it is the Cowboys. It is the Monday night matchup. Yes, I just wanted to make sure there. But as always, no matter who Joe Burrow is playing, just know that he always has a chance to put up MVP level numbers at least this season. I mean, his team might not win, and that might be a bad thing for their prospects in the future, the Bengals. But right now, Joe Burrow is playing like a prime MVP candidate for one of the most disappointing teams this season in the AFC. And so, in this match with the Cowboys, yes, it's kind of funny considering the fact the Cowboys are going to be coming into this one with a better record, but I still think the Bengals are the slightly better team because this offense doesn't care how your defense is playing. They're going to decimate it. They're going to dominate because they have the superstar talent. It is a matter of whether or not their defense shows up. Because in some certain games this season they have. But for the most part, they really haven't. And they've truly underachieved with one of the better defensive coordinators in the league in Lou Anarumo. I don't know what's going on with that relationship there, but it's truly concerning. But on the offside of football, just know that Joe Burrow is always going to be reliable because he's really unafraid of any team he's playing. It's just his defense is afraid of everyone it's playing, so to speak. But I really like Joe Burrow as a fantasy player for the long run because he's not going anywhere. His team might suffer around him over these next coming years, but he is going to be the constant no matter what, and he's still going to produce for you in terms of a fantasy perspective. So this weekend, specifically, look for Joe Burrow, win or lose, to continuously put up solid stats for you. In the running back position, this is more of a matchups-oriented one here. Alvin Kamara. This is a guy who, right now, is the Saints' saving grace. Without him, I really don't know how many wins he will be. As Teddy Belcher 4K Ultra Wide 21.9 points out, I believe he's talking about Burrow, this is his only chance to lead the league in yardage, and it's an unusual one at that. I completely agree that at the current point in time, I would say Joe Burrow is going to finish this year with the most passing yards in the NFL, just because of his prolific nature in that offense. But it's so disappointing that it comes in a kind of wasted season for Cincinnati. But it's a good point that this might be his only chance, and it's his least favorable chance in terms of team outlook and overall outlook. Because if it were the case that he ends up winning or getting to that yardage total and being the number one guy there, by all means he would have to be considered an MVP candidate, but right now he isn't. But getting back into the running back position, Alvin Kamara is someone who, like I said, is always going to get the bulk of the touches there in New Orleans because he is their best offensive weapon right now. And whether it be in the running game or even the passing game, Alvin Kamara gets it done for them. And going up against a Giants team that really has nothing to play for, really hasn't necessarily looked solid since, I don't know, potentially week 1 or 3 where they won some games. But I just feel like right now, even though the Saints are kind of in free fall mode after, there's a little bit of positivity after Darren Rizzi came in the interim, right now they're going to quickly descend down the rankings yet again, but Alvin Kamara is still going to be kind of like Joe Burrow at the quarterback position in that he's going to be a saving grace for this team from a fantasy standpoint and for you as well. So look for him in a matchup against one of the, if not the worst team in the league, Alvin Kamara, to really stand out. Because at the end of the day, he's like 1 or 2 in terms of guys who would want on my fantasy roster. Obviously, you have the stars, but Alvin Kamara, just because he's playing on a bad team does not mean his stock is going to rapidly decline. It means that he's an aberration, and you should play him as such, because you should know that being perhaps your best offensive player in a certain team means you're going to get the bulk of the touches. So that's what's going to happen to Alvin Kamara down the stretch. Then at the wide receiver position, another kind of chalk pick here. How about Justin Jefferson? Justin Jefferson's kind of the definition of a fantasy player who allows others to stand out around him. This season, he's really been kind of the occupier of space. That's more of like a soccer term. I'm not necessarily certain a lot of people are familiar with that term from a footballing perspective, but being an occupier of space means that you're still a valuable asset to your offense, but it means that other players are getting heightened production as a result. But this game against the Atlanta Falcons, he's going to have the toughest matchup, and he's going to have to work harder for his yardage. And I feel like, AJ Terrell can't follow him on every single snap. And Justin Jefferson's one of the best in terms of creating movement after the snap. He's the best in terms of finding his routes and getting to them and helping his quarterback in timely situations. That's really going to show out in this one against his former quarterback. He's going to want to have a revenge game and prove that he can be the star of this team even without a solid quarterback. And so that's why Justin Jefferson is going to be someone who, even though hasn't necessarily performed to the lofty standard people expected of him, is still going to prove his value in games such as this down the stretch for Minnesota. So that's why I really like him in this situation, going up against his former QB in Atlanta. Now, the tight end position, I really love this guy. Truly one of the more underrated players at his position. How about Dallas Goedert playing in what could be a very surprising NFC game against the Panthers? I feel like, the Panthers' defense has steadily improved over these past couple of weeks due to the rejuvenation of this team on the offensive side of the football as well. But Dallas Goedert is a very unique tight end in that he really adds to the physicality of this team, and for some reason his catching prowess gets lost in that. But he truly is one of the elite pass-catching tight ends in the league when you need him to be. He's timely, he's opportunistic, knows where the majority of his targets can end up, and as a result, makes himself available in those areas of the field. And that's all you can ask of a tight end, because of the fact he is so incorporated into their smash mouth style. When he does line up for routes, it kind of makes it a little bit more difficult for the defense to key in on how to stop him. And that's why I feel like in this instance, Dallas Goedert's really going to shine, because I feel like the Panthers are going to want to stop the run game and try and limit what Saquon does on the ground, and that will open up a lot more for Dallas Goedert's physicality to really show out in this one as well. So look for him to truly be an underrated starter for you this week. And then last but not least, defense and special teams speaks for itself. It's the Minnesota Vikings defense. There should be no other defense this highly ranked in my mind this weekend than the Minnesota Vikings defense, because who wouldn't be motivated to completely annihilate their former quarterback at his house? And so the Minnesota Vikings defense is going to come in here and saying that Kirk Cousins is a reason that our team was willing to let you go, and we're going to prove how deficient you are in terms of creating out of structure, because that's been the point of emphasis for Kirk Cousins' decline these past couple of weeks. He cannot compete out of structure, and he cannot extend plays because he sits in the pocket too long and hopes that his elite weapons get open. Most of the time, that doesn't necessarily happen. Maybe that's a fault on them. But for the most part, you were brought in to elevate this team, and as a result, it's going to be placed more on your shoulders to elevate this team as well. And while I still think he's the right answer right now at the quarterback position for them, if he continues to struggle and they slip out of a playoff spot, then maybe Michael Penix deserves consideration at the QB position. But the Vikings defense is not going to let up on him. They're really going to generate a lot of pressure, going to continuously blitz him with that aggressive Brian Flores style, and he's going to have to come up with a way to try and combat it, and I don't think he will. So that will leave it there for our favorite starts of the week and kind of segues into our favorite sits of the week, because of the fact that I think Kirk Cousins, it's pretty obvious what I'm going to say about him in that one. But we'll be right back after this short break to talk about more players who I think you should avoid this weekend.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And before we get into our second segment of the day here on today's show, I do want to remind you that if you feel so inclined throughout today's show, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can also do it through our website as well, GSMCpodcast.net. Leave a tip or donation or a comment there, or just consider doing it through YouTube as well. Either way is greatly appreciated by all. It just makes the show that much better. I love hearing all your great opinions on all things fantasy sports. Without further ado, let's jump right into our second segment of the day, where we have to talk about the starts, we have to talk about the sits, because there are going to be a lot of players who you might want to avoid this fantasy football weekend. And so I feel like, it's kind of getting defined in terms of how this week is going to play out, because there are going to be a lot of intra-conference games and divisional rivalries playing out, but there are some games where it's just coming down to one team I can physically see dominating the other. It may not add up to a win or loss for that respective team, but I do think there are going to be some deficiencies revealed, some flaws revealed for certain teams this week, and it stems from some of these players struggling in certain situations. So without further ado, let's jump right into them, starting off with a guy who's pretty obvious I'm going to mention here at the QB position. It is, of course, Kirk Cousins. Unfortunately, Kirk Cousins' decline has been overtly rapid these past couple of weeks. Only over 6 interceptions and 0 touchdowns these past 3 weeks here for Atlanta. They still control their destiny there in the NFC South. As wild as it is, they have the tiebreaker over the Bucs, so it's forcing the Bucs to really win out here. But they still have to win at least 2 out of the 3 next games to ensure that they lock up that NFC South title. And I don't necessarily know if Kirk Cousins is fully capable, because the Bucs schedule is a lot easier than the Falcons schedule, and the Falcons schedule starts off with a tough match against the Vikings. I believe they play the Commanders in about 2 weeks' time as well. So things are not going to get any easier for Kirk Cousins here. As much as people love him, and as much as he's had fascinating games these past couple of weeks in the season, I feel like he's starting to show that he simply has lost his luster as a starting QB in this league. Now, I'm all for keeping him in and not turning to Penix, because it shows that you're not necessarily trusting this investment, and Michael Penix Jr. is still a rookie, and he has very little starting experience in the NFL, let alone for a team wanting to make that playoff push. So I do feel that Kirk is going to remain the starter for the time being here, but if they slip out of the playoff race, you might want to see what Michael Penix Jr. has in the stretch. It's a disappointment in terms of the Falcons' investment in Kirk Cousins this season. So that's why I feel like in this game against his former team, he's going to really struggle to prove that he's a competent starting quarterback anymore in the National Football League. And then at the running back position, this just comes down to the matchup here and how I don't necessarily like this Bills offensive line protecting enough for James Cook against that feisty Rams defensive front. So that's why I think James Cook, unfortunately for me, especially as he's my running back in my personal fantasy league, is not going to necessarily play well for you. I do feel like there are moments where James Cook is going to have good games, but this is not one of them. This, I'm going to mention this later in my NFL implications segment, is going to be a trench warfare battle. It's going to be won or lost in the trenches for both of these teams. And a matchup where I see the Rams winning is generating pressure on running downs against this Bills offensive line. I do feel like Jared Verse and Braden Fisk are going to wreak havoc in the backfield, and it's going to be to the detriment of a guy like James Cook. I do think that the Bills are going to find ways around it, but it's not necessarily going to involve consistently trying to feed Cook and get him going, because they can find other ways to get going, we know. And it's not going to stem from trying to push the narrative that they can win this football game just by running it down the Rams' throats, because that's not going to happen. That's why I think James Cook is going to suffer in this matchup. And then next, I'm trying to talk about DJ Moore here at the wide receiver position. Another one, funnily enough, of my personal fantasy players. You can tell I'm kind of reeling in my fantasy league right now. But I do feel like DJ Moore in this match with the 49ers, as much as I want to say this could be a really interesting matchup here for him going up against these 49ers secondary pieces, I do think this has been a very disappointing season for DJ Moore in this offense. Seen potentially as the leader of it, potentially helping Caleb Williams in his first season, being that guy who has the experience in this offense, but he's really not necessarily stepped up for Caleb. And that's why the Bears are in a very tough spot right now. But I do think that Thomas Brown might be able to help that out a little bit, but definitely not in this game against the 49ers. I do think the 49ers, as decimated as they are on the defensive side of the football, still have enough to limit a guy like DJ Moore, who kind of feels out of it right now. You know what I mean? I feel like he's not necessarily that influential in this offense anymore. And it's to the detriment of this team, especially in late game situations where you need a guy who can be the difference maker for you. And that's why I don't necessarily see DJ Moore as effective of a fantasy asset as he was potentially in the middle of the season compared to now. And even though this offense I think will steadily improve, I can't necessarily see it to the point where, he's going to be a world beater these next couple of weeks, because the Bears are well and truly out of the playoff picture right now. And this is just about, trying to find the right pieces on offense. And potentially he could prove me wrong, but I don't necessarily think in this game he's going to stand out. And I might, sell him while he's hot, because he's definitely not played well for me these past couple of weeks, and potentially has cost me a couple games, cost me ground in the playoff race. So he's someone who I might even sell high this weekend, just because of the fact that, he hasn't really proved he can be a wide receiver one there in Chicago. Then the tight end position, this is a guy who I've tried to be high on these past couple of weeks, but has had a weird season thus far in the Steelers offense, and going up against a divisional rival in the Browns for the second time in 3 weeks, I think that he's either going to be an X factor or a bust for you. It's Pat Freiermuth. I'm leaning more towards bust in this one, just because of the fact that the last time we saw this matchup, we saw Russ really try to force a lot of throws downfield, and it was a really hit or miss offensive approach for Pittsburgh as a result. And so I feel like that could be the case yet again, even if the Browns in inclement weather don't necessarily come out as passionate as they were back then 2 weeks ago. But I still think it's going to be a tough matchup for Freiermuth in terms of getting meaningful targets. I do think that he could be a huge presence in terms of what he can be able to do to open up space down the field for Wilson and Pickens to connect, but I don't necessarily think he's going to be influential in terms of his own production. He's one of those weird receivers who can be absent for the entirety of a game and then suddenly show up when it matters, but over the past couple of weeks he's been more the former than the latter, if you know what I mean. And so that's why I can't really justify seeing Pat Freiermuth be consistent enough for you down the stretch, even though he's playing meaningful games. Because as I see it, the best parts of this Pittsburgh Steelers offense is Wilson's willingness to go downfield. If he's not comfortable with doing that, then I do believe Pittsburgh can get a little bit exploited when he has to work underneath and is forced to do that. And so, even though I appreciate Pat Freiermuth for what he can be for this Pittsburgh offense, he's going to have to prove it on the stretch, because none of these matchups are really favorable for Pittsburgh, if you want me to be honest with you down the stretch here. They have to play the Chiefs on Christmas Day, the Eagles the week before that. So I just feel like down the stretch in these couple of games, we're going to really see if Pat Freiermuth is elite. But it's funny that I think that he's not going to show up in this one because it's against the Browns. But then again, it's a divisional game, and the Browns have already proven that they're passionate enough to beat you the first time. So why not the second time? And even though it's going to be a huge X factor in this one, if he does get going, I don't necessarily see it for the entirety of the game. So that's why I feel like Pat Freiermuth could prove me wrong, but also I feel like is going to disappoint more often than not in this one, and that's why he sits on my sit list for this week. And then for the defense, I feel like the Raiders' defense is going to be a disappointment this week. I do believe they're playing the Buccaneers. Let me really check that real quick, because I don't want to sound like a fool. They are playing the Buccaneers this week, and the reason why I say this is because I do feel like the Raiders can make this a game, right? They prove that they're still passionate enough to compete against the NFL's elite. They made that game really kind of tough for the Chiefs to pull out in these last couple of minutes. They had that weird mistake at the end of the game where the center snapped the football before O'Connell was even ready, and that really cost them. But in this specific matchup, you're facing a very aggressive Bucs team who's fighting for their playoff lives right now. You don't necessarily want to go up against a ticked-off Bucs team. You don't want to go up against a ticked-off Baker Mayfield. And That's the reason why, even though this Raiders defense can really make things muddy for Bucks, I feel like they're not going to show up wholeheartedly. They expended a lot of energy in that matchup against the Chiefs. That was their Super Bowl, and this one I think they'll be a little bit less motivated against a Bucks team that's really amped up for this playoff stretch for them. So look for the Raiders to come out a little bit flat in this one, but overall, I feel like all of these hits have something in common. They're in very specific matchups where their flaws are completely ready to be decimated, right? Because I feel like in most of these matchups, either there's a clear advantage for the opposing team, or it's just going to come down to, improvisation for some of these teams, right? Like in the case of James Cook. But other than that, I think it's pretty clear that a lot of these players are not going to be highly coveted this week. Let me know what you think about them all in the comments. But coming up next on our show, we switch over to some big implications in terms of fantasy. It's one of the NFL's biggest games of the weekend. Tune in to see which ones I feel will give you a lot of fantasy production right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of the day here on today's show, which over to some huge fantasy implications on some big games that I looked at this week. And I think the bulk of your fantasy production for this week will come from these 4 games. And I feel like they're a good set of games, a couple divisional rivalries, a couple of intra-conference games that I really think stand out on paper. But we're going to have to see how they all play on the field because I could be completely wrong about them. For example, one of these games was on my list a couple of weeks ago, and it completely proved me wrong in how it played out. So I'm going to have to take my word for gospel, but I'm just going to be keeping my eye on this game in terms of specific fantasy production from specific players and specific units as well. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with the game that I'm repeating here after a 2-week hiatus on this list. It's Seahawks-Cardinals, the second iteration of this game over the past 3 weeks. And the reason why I think so is that's going to be a more exciting matchup in this one in the desert. And I feel like, a lot of people might be saying that this is the Cardinals' time to shine. It definitely could be. They know now that the Seahawks are willing to sell out to stop the run. So they're going to be aggressive in coming out with a run game, setting the tone with James Conner, and hoping that will open up a lot of plays for Kyler Murray to make either with his own legs or down the field in the passing game. But on the other side of the football, this is a defense that I feel has really sharpened up. A lot of people might be turning to it right now as a late addition to their team to make a playoff push, but also the special teams concerns as well could add up to a very interesting situation there in terms of whether or not you might want to start them in a last-minute move. But on the offensive side of the football as well for the Seahawks, it's going to come down to the timeliness of JSN. I think JSN is going to be the X factor for this offense. He is one of the prime movers of the chain in terms of this offense. Very reliable. As Little Fettuccine 68 putting me on the spot here and asking who is the best in the NFL right now. Well, I think the Lions proved it last night, huh? I feel like that was a big win for them, even though decimated as they were on the defensive side of the football, they might kind of have to fix that. I feel like they proved that they can play with anyone, no matter the situation for them in terms of injury status or what have you. I think the Lions proved last night that they can win any kind of game as well, and most importantly, remain efficient. Efficiency is what's going to matter in the NFC side of the bracket, I feel like. And if you're not efficient, chances are the Lions are going to dominate you on their way to their first Super Bowl in quite some time. The first Super Bowl ever, for that matter. So, I think the Lions are the best. Thank you for that question. Moving back into the Seahawks-Cardinals game. I think JSN, like I said, is going to be the biggest X factor, but look for potentially Kenneth Walker to have a bigger say in the outcome of this game than he did 2 weeks ago, because I do feel like there can be moments for the Seattle run game to really shine, but it's going to have to stem from running between the numbers rather than relying on this offensive line to pull for you, just because they've really struggled in that regard. They've really struggled in terms of getting out in space, getting to the second level, and protecting Kenneth Walker in those short yardage situations. So that's going to be something to monitor here for Seattle. Then moving on to another kind of NFC West game, but in an intra-conference setting, Bills-Rams. And I talked about this a little bit when I was talking about James Cook potentially being someone to avoid from a fantasy standpoint, because I think, like I said, it's going to be a battle of the trenches. And it's going to come down to both of these defenses trying to sell out to stop certain aspects of these respective offenses. For the Bills, I think that if you play your trademark zone coverage, you should be fine in limiting what the Rams can do in the passing game. Because I feel like a lot of the Rams' passing game this season relies on yards after catch. It relies on intelligent route running. And I feel like the Bills are very well equipped to handle that. But the reason why, when I look at the Bills' offense, and I'm a little bit apprehensive in terms of what this outlook could be for James Cook, I feel like this Rams defensive front is also going to be a huge X factor, and they might be a solid play this week from a fantasy standpoint if they're able to limit James Cook like I think they will, because of the fact these two young studs, Jared Verse and Braden Fisk, top draft picks this year, are really starting to wreak havoc in the backfield. Maybe they're not necessarily filling the shoes of Aaron Donald, but they're very competent in what they're able to do. And so I feel like it's going to stem down to if the Bills' offensive line can stay on schedule in terms of helping this run game. Because I do think for the best parts of the Bills' offense stem and are predicated on this run game getting going. I do feel like if the run game isn't there, that the Bills are one of the better improvisational teams, and Josh Allen's perhaps the best improvisational quarterback in the entire National Football League. But I do think that's where the Rams are going to pinpoint their focus on, trying to at least limit one aspect of the Bills' offensive game plan to try and get them off schedule, try and disrupt their rhythm. And that's where I kind of feel like this game is going to be won or lost, because granted, a lot of people might say this is an easy game for the Bills, but I really don't think it is, because the Rams are playing a physical style of football, and they are a team you not want to see hot in these December months, because if they make the playoffs, if they win the NFC West, then chances are they can make a very shockingly deep playoff run. They're peaking at the right time on the defensive side of the football, and it's a matter of this offense really clicking and trying to put up as many points as possible against the NFL's elite, because they have one of the easier schedules in the NFC West. They could potentially win out, but it's a matter of continuously developing week in and week out on the defensive side of the football, and they could be a fun team to monitor come playoff time. But on the Bills side of things, it's just about being yourself. It's just about doing what you need to do to win this football game. And there's no better team in the NFL in my mind at doing that than Buffalo, outside of perhaps the Lions. We'll have to see how the Lions operate when Jared Goff has to perform out of structure in the playoffs. I'll leave it at that. Then the next one, kind of an underrated game in the weekend slate. Another divisional rivalry. Not many people might be paying attention to this one. But the Jets going up against the Dolphins, trying to make a last-minute playoff push here, trying to steal a wild card spot. They're going to have to win perhaps all of their games to even get to that point, to even be in that conversation. But I think they're capable of it when Tua and this offense are clicking. But on the Jets side of things, we've seen this team take advantage of others' mistakes. We saw it last week against Seattle. This is going to be more of an opportunistic team on the stretch here. I think that it's going to be weird trying to call them and justify calling them spoilers because they haven't looked like spoilers these past couple of weeks. But ultimately, I think in this divisional matchup, it's going to come down to the timeliness of the defense's play. It's going to come down to what Aaron Rodgers can do in certain situations, and ultimately how this team operates under pressure, because chances are Tua's going to put up a lot of points on the board. It's going to be up to you to really try and limit what he can do when you have the football, because if you play the ball retention game, it's going to be difficult in terms of putting up as many points as you want to try and make this a game. But if Aaron Rodgers proves that those throws that he was missing on can be hit, if he proves that some of the things we see from him out of structure can be to the Jets' advantage, then we might have a game here. But it's all going to come down to all the things that have gone wrong for the Jets going right, and that's really a crapshoot right now. It's really a toss-up. And so, as much as I want to justify Rodgers spoiling the fun here, I think that the only reason I'm this high on this game from a fantasy standpoint is because it was a divisional matchup and anything can happen. But I do feel like the best parts of the Jets' offense can come when people least expect it. So take that with a grain of salt. You might want to shy away from this game, but just know that this Jets team looks like it can have the exoskeleton, at the very least, of a competent team. It's just a matter of putting it all together. And the last game that I want to talk about for this Sunday slate, actually the last game on Sunday, perhaps the best game of Sunday, a big one in the AFC West. We talked about this a little bit. We're going to continue to talk about it to conclude today's show. Chargers, Chiefs. And I suggested yesterday, I'll continue to suggest it in our final segment today, that this has the makings of potential AFC West takeover. I feel like the Chargers defensively are going to be prepped and ready to go to really limit this Chiefs offense that has been pretty underwhelming this entire year. In every single metric, they're kind of middle of the pack in terms of how they play. The reason why I'm a little bit apprehensive to say I'm all in on a potential upset here is just because Justin Herbert, like I said, might be a bit uncomfortable reverting to playing hero ball again, because that's what he's going to need to do to keep up with this Chiefs team. Because I do think there are points to be had for this Chiefs offense against this Chargers defense. It's going to be difficult to come by, but there are moments where this Chargers defense looks vulnerable. Remember, they're playing with two rookie corners in Cam Hart and I believe it's Alohi Gilman. So they're going to want to put pressure on them as much as possible. And they have field stretchers to do that. They have a guy like Xavier Worthy who's not afraid to get vertical. They have players underneath that they can rely upon in terms of yardage to catch, like Travis Kelce. And they're also going to want to incorporate Isaiah Pacheco a little bit more, now that he's back, into their run game. So there are going to be a lot of different things the Chargers are going to have to look at on the defensive side of the football. But the Chargers' offense is really boom or bust right now, because we saw last week against Atlanta the deficiencies of not having a run game, especially in the Jim Harbaugh era, because when J.K. Dobbins went down 2 weeks ago now against Baltimore, we really saw how Justin Herbert, I'm really confusing players now. Justin Herbert was impacted in that one. It was not really positive. He was forced to throw a lot more downfield, and as a result, the lack of depth of the wide receiver position was slightly revealed there, and it reared its ugly head in that win against Atlanta. But this time around, I feel like if Justin Herbert plays efficiently, not necessarily heroically, if he plays efficiently, I can feel moments where the Chargers look to take control of this game. I still think the Chiefs are going to win it outright, but there are going to be moments where the timeliness of the Chargers' play really stands out, and we start to think about the future of this division a little bit more in terms of what the Chargers can be able to do in, say, 3 to 5 years to usurp the Chiefs as the best team in the AFC West. It may not happen in this game, but there are going to be moments where we're going to say, wow, this Chargers team are on the precipice of doing something not many people thought any team could do in that division, and that's usurp the Chiefs. So all 4 of these games, again, whether they be divisional rivalries or intra-conference matchups, are going to be vital in terms of determining how your fantasy roster looks this weekend. Let me know what you think about all these games in the comments, because coming next week we're going to have a really interesting segment talking about a specific conference championship game that could determine a lot in the outcome of the CFP picture. We'll be right back after the break to talk about what it is.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our 4th segment of the day, it's a little bit of an unusual one. As you all know, Conference Championship Weekend takes place tomorrow in the world of college football. A lot of exciting games with a lot of huge stakes. But the one I'm going to be discussing today perhaps has some of the more unusual ones in terms of the CFP picture than most. It's one that definitely not a lot of people are going to be tuning into in terms of the big brands that you want to see. The Texases, the Georgias of the world, the Oregons, the Penn States of the world. But this game means a lot, and it's an underrated one in terms of the betting picture. So you might want to keep your ears peeled when I talk about betting statistics in this one. Further ado, let's talk about the Mountain West Conference Championship game. UNLV, Boise State. And this one, in terms of theoretically, is simple for both of these teams. In terms of hypotheticals, this, for all intents and purposes, looks like a win and in game. But there are so many different outcomes here for all the chaos that could happen around it that makes it so special. Because these teams, no bars hold, are the teams right now that control their playoff destiny. For UNLV, it's a unique position after all the hectic natures of their team off the field. And for Boise State, it's an opportunity to highlight one of the most special players in college football this season and showcase him on a more grand scale than they could before. But in terms of how this plays out, in terms of whether or not it plays out how we expect it to, a Boise State win compared to UNLV win could toss some things out the window here and create some chaos situations that a lot of people are going to want to monitor. So without further ado, let's dissect it a little bit from a betting perspective, and most importantly, from an overall outlook for both outcomes for this game. So Boise State are the favorites in this one, 3.5-point favorites. The over-under is 58.5 because both of these offenses, we know, can be very high-powered in certain moments. And we're also going to talk about this game, at least from a player standpoint and who stands out. But let's get into the wackiness that could ensue based off the results of this game. So it's easy, pretty easy if Boise State wins. They're in. They potentially get a first-round bye, say if Iowa State wins the Big 12. Or, if people feel justified in saying that the winner of that Big 12 championship should be placed higher and get the first-round bye over Boise State, they're going to go as the 12th seed. For UNLV, it's pretty much the same, except I don't necessarily think they'll be the first-round bye team, even if, Iowa State wins the Big 12, just because even though this win will look good on the resume, they don't have many other wins that will look pretty good on the resume. But let's talk about, the outcome first for the group of 5 and first for Power 4 conference and then for Power 4 conferences in terms of how important this game is. Because in terms of the group of 5, while Army, per se, seems out of it, they're currently ranked 24th. So let's say UNLV wins this game. Army, if they win, could be justified in saying, well, we were ranked And while UNLV was ranked consistently this season as well, we have proved that we, as a one-loss team to a ranked opponent, potentially one of the best teams in the nation right now in terms of overall play over these last couple of weeks, that's our only loss, we can say that we're better than this team. And now they don't have Boise State to worry about, their case can become more convincing. But it's all going to stem on how they play against Tulane, right? Because Tulane is also a dangerous team that you can't take for granted. Yes, they're out of the playoff picture, but they can put up points on you in a hurry. And so Army's most likely going to have to blow the doors off Tulane to really remain in this conversation, because right now their case is not compelling. But then, when we look a bit deeper into the Power 4 games, I feel like two respective matchups, the Big 12 and the ACC championships, could prove to muddy the waters here based off the outcome of this game. So, if UNLV wins, right, they're in. But let's talk about the ACC picture and the Big 12 picture, because Arizona State and Iowa State, nobody expected them to be here, right? But if Arizona State wins, I feel it's simple. You're either the 12th seed, and if you play well and the committee views you as playing at a higher level than UNLV, you might just get the first round bye. But if Iowa State wins and UNLV wins, you're now looking at a very deep pool of 2 or 3 loss teams that can muddy the waters. You're looking at a 2-loss ACC third place team in Miami. You're looking at all those 3-loss teams in the SEC. And now you're looking at an Arizona State team who has very good losses but might as well be out because they're in the Big 12. This is where all these debates come into play. On the ACC side of things, that where it could get crazier, because for all intents and purposes, if SMU wins, they're in. But if Clemson wins, who do you put in? SMU or one of those 3-loss SEC teams? That's where the outcome of this one gets a little bit hectic if UNLV wins, because those two championship games really are dependent on Boise State winning. Because if you know Boise State wins, you know that they're going to either have the first round bye or enter as the 12th seed. And you know, say, if you're Clemson or Iowa State, you just have to win and you're in. But if UNLV wins, and then Iowa State and Clemson win as well, all those upsets really muddy the waters of how the committee are going to have to think there. Do you now consider more 3-loss SEC teams other than Alabama potential playoff participants? Do you consider a 2-loss SMU team over Alabama because of the fact that Alabama is the bigger brand, but SMU perhaps has played the more clean football these past couple of weeks? Does Miami re-enter the picture now that we have more 2-loss teams? It's also the fact that all these teams are playing in a conference championship game might help them outside of, say, Iowa State and Clemson, because if they lose, they're most likely out. So that's where, if I'm the committee, a lot of chaos can happen. If these 3 teams, UNLV, Iowa State, and Clemson, all win, then you're going to have to open the doors for a whole new debate. But in terms of that, I feel like this game is just going to come down to the players in the field, who we haven't really mentioned at all yet in this segment, because these players, let's give them credit here, because we don't often talk about the group of 5 that often here on the show. We should give them their flowers, because these group of 5 players are unsung heroes. They might have decided to forego going to a Power 4 conference, or have struggled at lower levels of the college ranks, and these were the teams that were the only ones that would give them this opportunity, and they've shown they can be premier players at the college football level. And no matter all their trials and tribulations, this is their shot to prove it. And so both of these teams are representative of that mindset, of wanting to play for these smaller level schools and bring them into the national spotlight, and I applaud them for it. But in this matchup, it's going to come down to 2 players, and they're not the players you think. On the Boise State side of the football, we know who's going to be the focal point. It's Ashton Jeanty, the Heisman Trophy candidate, and he might just win this award if he has a big day. But if he doesn't, let's look at Maddox Matson, the redshirt sophomore, a guy who many people were not expecting to start because of the fact that Malachi Nelson, the 5-star transfer from USC, came in, and many thought that he was going to be the starter. But Maddox Matson supplants him, and throughout the season has really proven he can operate this offense at an effective level. But is that because of the fact he has Ashton Jeanty in the backfield, or because he's an actual competent quarterback? Because remember, in this matchup against UNLV in the regular season, Ashton Jeanty was very limited, and there were moments where Maddox Matson looked mortal. In this matchup, UNLV is going to want to generate as much pressure as possible on him while also loading the box to stop Jeanty, and they were the most effective team this season in doing that to a T. And so look for them to try and replicate that again. So on the Boise side of the football, if Jeanty struggles early, look for the pressure to fall on Maddox Matson's shoulders. He's going to have to deliver. He certainly has capable weapons in the receiving game like Trell Caples, but he's also going to have to rely on the fact that potentially Ashton Jeanty's not going to show up. So he's going to have to step up his game in an important atmosphere. On the UNLV side of things, a lot of people are saying that Hajj Malik Williams, this kind of surprise story guy, stepping in after the whole Matthew Sluka situation and really proving that he can operate this offense just as effectively as Sluka did. And his story is just remarkable. But it's going to come down to his receivers, right? Ricky White III might just be the second best player in the football field on Saturday. This is a guy that's a difference maker in the receiving game, one of the top receivers in the nation outside of the Power 4. And I feel like, Hajj Malik Williams, in terms of his dual threat ability, is a lot more exciting and thrilling than what Matthew Sluka brought. Because I actually saw Matthew Sluka at the FCS level when I was at Fordham. He was at Holy Cross. So this is someone in Hajj Malik Williams who could do a lot more for you with his arms and his legs. But Ricky White III is going to have to get separation against this Boise State team because that front is going to want to generate as much pressure as possible on Williams. They have great guys in their front who are going to be active in that backfield if they can't get going. So look for Ricky White to have to get open early and often in this one to keep pace with what the Boise State offense could potentially do. Let me know what you think about this game and the situations that can ensue in the CFP should different outcomes play out. And so that's why I wanted to highlight this game. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. But to conclude today's show in the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, it's my start sit-em for Sunday Night Football, Chargers-Chiefs, to close out the show. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of the day and week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and it's our start sit for Sunday Night Football. Should you have any players for the Chargers and for the Chiefs here now, this game is going to come down to a lot of key players on both sides of the football. I feel that the Chargers offense is a little bit more clear-cut than the Chiefs just because of the fact that the Chiefs can get going at any different time. We know that. We know that the Chiefs' offense can either be more stagnant or more potent than we think. On the Chargers side of things, it's pretty clear-cut now that we know that J.K. Dobbins is out. So without further ado, let's jump right into these different players, whether starting or sitting for Sunday Night Football, starting with the Chiefs because they are a little bit more complicated, as I said, because the Chiefs are a team where you feel like you know who the best players in terms of real life and fantasy are going to be, but it hasn't really translated this season to consistency. And in this game, against a divisional opponent who's wanting to potentially usurp you as the premier team in your division, different players feel like they're going to have to step up, but I'm not necessarily confident, even in the starting players, in terms of how they look in this one. But overall, I just went on my gut here in terms of who I feel will play the best. And I think that it all starts with Pat Mahomes. I think he is going to be the focal point in this one. I feel like the Chargers' defense is good enough to put him in different situations where you're going to want to generate a lot of pressure on him, and he's going to have to make quick decisions, which we know he can. And so I feel like as much as Patrick Mahomes has underwhelmed this season, he still is a difference maker. He still is someone who at the end of the day you're always going to want to rely on at any level. Real life, fantasy, what have you, whether you like it or not, because of the fact that not many people have been able to bring him off his pedestal. And until a divisional opponent does it, I'm not convinced that this guy can be slowed down by an AFC West team just yet, even though the Raiders tried to do it last week. So look for Patrick Mahomes to continue his consistency against AFC West teams. I mean, they'll look pretty all the time, mind you, and it's not necessarily an indictment of him, but I do feel like it's going to stem down to his abilities to make plays out of structure in this one, and I think he's going to be able to do it better than anyone against this Chargers defense. And another guy who I think you should start, another usual suspect here for the Chiefs, Travis Kelce, because I feel like, the deep shot is not a huge part, or as huge a part as we thought it would be right now for the Chiefs. Obviously, you have two guys who can extend the field, and Xavier Worthy and DeAndre Hopkins, but I think a lot of stuff is going to be available to you underneath if you're the Chiefs in this one, and Travis Kelce loves that. He lives in the middle of the field, and I feel like Patrick Mahomes is always going to look to him in moments of desperation, and that's always worked for the Chiefs. And why not have it work against a Chargers team that I feel like you can exploit in terms of underneath routes to get going. You don't necessarily have to take the top off them, even though a guy like Joe Burrow certainly could, and Lamar Jackson as well. But I feel like that's where Patrick Mahomes has been most comfortable this season. Maybe in other seasons that was a different case. But ultimately, if they want to move the ball and retain it, most importantly, keep it out of Justin Herbert's hands, then Travis Kelce's your guy. In terms of guys who I think are going to sit, let's talk about Isaiah Pacheco a little bit, because I could definitely be proven wrong in this one, because I know the Chiefs are a team that will love to get the run game going here and take the pressure off Patrick Mahomes. But I just feel like Isaiah Pacheco is one of those guys who can be effective for you, but not in the way you really want him to, because he's more of a chunk playback. He's not someone who's going to break one down the field, get you big plays. He's someone who's methodical in nature. And I feel like that somewhat stagnates the Chiefs' offense at some points, especially deep down the field in the red zone. So look for Isaiah Pacheco to potentially have a quieter night than you think. I know a lot of people place a lot of stock in him this season from a fantasy standpoint, but he's not one of those guys who I completely rely on to put up big numbers in this Chiefs offense anymore. He's just more of a tone setter, if anything, in certain games. And at worst, in this matchup, he's just going to be a guy who's 3 inches in a cloud of dust, if you know what I mean. And then in terms of receivers, I think Xavier Worthy is the guy you're going to be looking to avoid in this matchup. I feel like a lot of people kind of sold him while the ceiling was high, and not for nothing, I wanted him to succeed in the league, but right now he's a little bit too raw. Maybe in the future they use him in a little bit more of a gadget situation, then he could be effective for this offense. But I feel like since the injury to Rashee Rice, he was forced into more of a bigger role, and even with DeAndre Hopkins as well, I feel like we're starting to see the limitations of him as a top option for an NFL team. I still think he's more in the realm of a gadget guy who can be used in different situations, but ultimately the Chiefs They're going to have to rely on him down the stretch. That's the way of the law for them right now in terms of trying to generate some deep shots. But in this matchup, I don't necessarily think it's going to happen as often as, underneath routes to Travis Kelce will. So that's why I feel Xavier Worthy's not going to be an effective player for you from a fantasy standpoint. Now let's look into the Chargers side of things because it's a little bit more clear-cut. Because right now, the big focal point right now, and the one guy you have to start for the Chargers and hope he can put up good numbers for you is Justin Herbert. And the reason why I say hope is because, well, even though in the Brandon Staley era, when he was more forced to put up big numbers, as Tapton says, Nuke Hopkins will be still an excellent possession receiver, and I agree with that. I feel like in terms of this offense, though, I'm not necessarily certain his identity is strong enough to go beyond what Pat Mahomes and Travis Kelce have developed. Because in this matchup, I feel like there are going to be opportunities to be had where Mahomes can take a deep shot. It's going to be more about who you trust rather than trying to take that risk. Because granted, as much as I want to get off the bandwagon for the Chargers defense and get off the bandwagon of these two rookie corners in particular, they've been spectacular all season. They just had 2 games out of 14 or so in which they looked pretty mortal. And so while the Chiefs certainly have the opportunities to exploit that, I just feel like familiarity is going to breed success this Chiefs team. As much as I think Nuke Hopkins could be an X factor, I think this Pat Mahomes-Travis Kelce relationship is going to reveal to be the way for the Chiefs, especially if they want to make a deep postseason run as well. I appreciate Nuke Hopkins for what he is, but I just don't see it in this particular game right now. Going over to the Chargers side of things, I feel like Justin Herbert has to be the guy. As I also suggest that Gus Edwards, this has been super quiet time for him to step up. I don't think he will step up in this game. It's a perfect segue into what I think about Gus Edwards in this offense. I just feel like, if Gus Edwards had been kind of the situation back for the Chargers early on, and J.K. Dobbins not really taken over the role for himself, then maybe he would have been an apt replacement. But right now, what we saw in Atlanta was not indicative of what the Chargers' run game was this season. I just feel like J.K. Dobbins was so dominant and really made that role his own that now these backs are suffering because they may not have gotten as many touches as they expected this season. So that's why Gus Edwards in this game kind of will feel overwhelmed against a very solid Chiefs front here. Especially, on the interior when Chris Jones is going to be moving around a lot and trying to limit what they do in the run game. That's why Gus Edwards just feels very stagnant in this matchup. I feel like a lot of people might have turned to him on the waiver wire once J.K. Dobbins went down, but I don't necessarily think that was the flow of this offense, And it's not something the Chargers themselves expected, right? Because they thought it was going to be a by-committee approach because of the fact these two guys were stellar in Baltimore and they expected them to translate as well to here. But that hasn't been the case, and so we're now seeing how that affects this team after this Dobbins injury. But in terms of receiving threats, the Chargers, because that's going to be an important aspect of their game, I feel like timeliness is going to come into play. And the timeliest of receivers for the Chargers this season has been Ladd McConkey. I know a lot of guys are trying to undermine him a little bit just because he has stepped up in big moments but has been absent in terms of game flow. And that's something that people have tried to nick him on in terms of trying to diminish his achievements in this team. But I feel like he's the most competent receiver in terms of maintaining possession. He is their possession receiver, as Tapton said, for Nuke Hopkins. I feel like in this game, while Justin Herbert definitely has the ability to play hero ball, much like Mahomes, he's going to want to go with his familiar stuff. He's going to want to be efficient, most importantly. Keep Mahomes on the bench as long as possible. So Ladd McConkey is that guy for him, and he's proven that he can do it consistently for this team. On the other side of things, two guys who I think the people have really forgotten about, or one guy in particular who these people have really forgotten about, is Josh Palmer, because he was seen as one of those underrated guys for this team a couple of years ago when they still had Keenan Allen. And so Josh Palmer, now that he's not necessarily an unsung hero for the Chargers getting revealed a little bit. He's not necessarily as effective of a possession or deep threat receiver as we thought he was going to be, and he's really limiting, what Justin Herbert can do in certain areas of the field. I feel like Quentin Johnston could also be a play in this game just because of his verticality and what Justin Herbert might want to do in the downfield passing game in this one. But for the time being, Joshua Palmer has really lost his luster. I feel like he needs a guy like Keenan Allen to occupy certain areas of the field so he can get open for himself, but he can't necessarily create for himself, nor can he create for others. And I can't say the same for Ladd McConkey because he's proven he can open up different areas of the field for different guys. It's just a matter of Justin Herbert relying on him to do that over others as well. And that's where I feel like that's the trouble with this Chargers offense in this game. It can be stagnant if Justin Herbert's trying to force feed the ball to Ladd McConkey in this game. But ultimately, it's going to come down to familiarity, and familiarity is the Chiefs in this matchup. As Splashman says, home field will be huge in December against the Cowboys. And I feel like if the Chiefs do end up facing the Chargers in the playoffs, that will be big as well. The weather in this one I don't think will be a huge factor, but in the December months, as it gets colder, it will be in the postseason. And the Chargers might want to get the Chiefs while they're ahead in the regular season and try and save their pride for the offseason should they face the Chiefs again. But let me know what you think about this game in the comments, because that will just about do it for today's show. I've been Christopher Shepard. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Like, follow, and subscribe. Make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Other than that, I am out for today and the week.